The animosity between Newcastle United and Sunderland owes itself to one of England's most historic rivalries, predating the inception of football by over 200 years. Let's rewind back to the late 16th century, when King Charles I awarded coal trade rights to Newcastle merchants, rendering their Wearside counterparts redundant. This caused extreme poverty in Sunderland, leading to loss of jobs, and unfortunately in turn, a loss of lives. Trade would be focused on the Tyne. However, the tables would turn 2 years after the start of the English Civil War, as Sunderland's anti-monarch separatists teamed up with the Scottish Army at the Battle of Bolden Hill. Newcastle's Crown loyalists were defeated, and Sunderland would take control of the local coal trade for nearly 2 decades, until the monarchy was reinstated in 1660 and Tyneside merchants regained their status as the top dogs of the northeast. It was this spilling of civil blood that would ultimately sow the seeds of one of football's fiercest rivalries. Sunderland were formed in 1879 by Scottish schoolteacher James Allen, playing their first competitive football match in the 1884 FA Cup. By 1888, disagreements between members saw the founding of a breakaway team called Sunderland Albion. Their star would shine fast and bright, disbanding in 1892 after a number of failed attempts to join the Football League. That same year, the OG Sunderland announced themselves within English football, establishing their championship credentials by winning the league in 1892, 1893 and 1895, then taking residence in their new home, Roker Park, in 1898. But whilst the Wearside club were experiencing early success, another plucky upstart had set up shop down the road in Newcastle. In 1882, the football team of Stanley rebranded themselves as Newcastle East End, whilst, on the other side of the city, another footballing startup emerged, West End Football Club. The financially flush Newcastle East End would attract better players and greater gate receipts, eventually leaving West End on the brink of collapse in the 1891-92 season. Their West End rivals would then lease East End their ground at St James's Park, leaving only one senior side on the Tyne. Seeing success on Wearside and having lost their first official game against Sunderland 2-0 in the 1888 FA Cup, Newcastle East End knew they'd have to radically shake things up to compete at the highest level, rebranding themselves as Newcastle United in 1892. That decade, they would join the Football League's Division 2, change their kit from East End's red to black and white stripes, and later gain promotion to Division 1. By the start of the 20th century, Sunderland would secure their 4th league title in 1902. Famed as a formidably physical and tough-tackling team, their direct style would frequently blow away the opposition. But down the road, Newcastle were taking notes, developing their own unique style. The slick passers of St James's Park would enter a golden era, lifting the First Division title 3 times and reaching multiple FA Cup finals, finally lifting the cup in 1910. However, a couple of years prior to this, Sunderland would register the biggest winning scoreline in the history of the derby. Despite playing at St James's Park and going into the half-time break level at 1-1, they ran riot in the second half, smashing in 8 goals and trouncing their rivals 9-1, writing the 1908 team into Mackem folklore forever. Following World War I, the North East would belong to Newcastle, who won the league title in 1927, as well as the 1924 and 1932 FA Cup finals, now being played at Wembley. Sunderland fans would berate their local counterparts for the second of these FA Cup victories for the over-the-line incident. Naysayers claimed that Jimmy Richardson's cross went out of play before Jack Allen buried the ball to equalise against Arsenal, but with no VAR to spoil the celebrations, the goal stood. Allen scored again and Newcastle lifted the cup. 2 years later, the Magpies would suffer their first relegation. Down the road, the Black Cats started plotting their own resurgence, forming another formidable team, with the likes of Eddie Burbanks, Bobby Gurney and Rach Carter, claiming their 6th league title in 1936, followed by FA Cup success in 1937, beating Preston North End 3-1 in a thrilling encounter. Following World War II, the Toon Army morphed into an FA Cup winning machine in the 50s, with victories celebrated on Tyneside in 1951, 1952 and 1955, club legends Jackie Milburn and later George Robledo and Bobby Mitchell underpinned the spirit of the Newcastle fans on the pitch, whereas down the River Wear, Sunderland just couldn't get their footballing formula right. Dubbed the Bank of England club in the 50s, by Christmas 1955, high-spending Sunderland harboured hopes of chasing down the table-topping Busby Babes of Manchester United. However, their title ambitions were rapidly dashed. After losing 4-0 to Huddersfield on Christmas Eve, Sunderland had a festive double against Newcastle scheduled on Boxing Day at Roker Park, and then again 24 hours later at St James's Park. Unfortunately for the Wearsiders, within about 26 hours, Newcastle had registered a famous Derby double, as Sunderland were thumped 6-1 in the first encounter, followed by a comprehensive 3-1 defeat in the latter. Despite continuing to spend the big bucks at Sunderland, star quality didn't translate into success. The Black Cats' luck ran out in 1958 as they were relegated to Division 2. In 1961, they were joined by Newcastle. Sunderland escaped first, promoted in 1964. Newcastle followed the next season and, later that decade, had their crowning moment in the Intercities Fairs Cup, beating the Titans of Ujpest-Dosa 6-2, delivering European silverware to Tyneside and a sense of superiority in the northeast. The next season saw more celebrations on Tyneside, but this time there was no trophy involved. Sunderland were once again relegated. However, a few years later, and despite no longer dining at English football's top table, the Black Cats managed to pull off one of the greatest upsets in FA Cup history in 1973, beating Don Revie's imperious Leeds United team, thanks to Ian Porterfield's winner and Jim Montgomery's famous double save. A brief European run followed, as well as promotion in 1976, but another relegation came swiftly after. As the lights flickered during the 3-day week across the UK, Sunderland yo-yoed between divisions, while Newcastle, powered by Supermac Malcolm MacDonald, came close to silverware twice, only to lose both the 1974 and 1976 Cup finals. By 1978, though, their own inconsistency saw them relegated once more. The 80s proved to be a difficult time for the people of Newcastle and Sunderland. Off the pitch, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's policies effectively dismantled much of the region's industry, devastating families across the northeast. On the pitch, the clubs mostly traded places rather than blows, seldom sharing a division. Sunderland went up in 1980 and down again in 1985. However, Newcastle, lifted by the brilliance of Keegan, Beardsley and Waddle, surged back to the First Division in 1984, playing football that, for a time, captured the imagination of the whole country. Unfortunately, though, neither side could sustain momentum. By the end of the decade, both were back where they started. Newcastle, now without their former stars, were relegated in 1989, whereas Sunderland seemed stuck in another cycle of promotion and decline. 1990 would see another high-stakes encounter between the two fierce rivals. Both missing out on automatic promotion, they met at the playoff semi-finals. With nothing separating the teams going into the second leg at St James's, Newcastle just couldn't make their home advantage count. An early strike by Eric Gates, followed by an 86th minute winner, courtesy of Marco Gabbiadini, saw the game halted for 20 minutes due to a pitch invasion, and Sunderland eventually booking their place in the playoff final. However, and as had been the case for the previous decades, in the 90s, Sunderland would again yo-yo between the top two leagues, whereas Newcastle, under the guidance of Kevin Keegan, would assemble a new team of entertainers. Indeed, their swashbuckling brand of football eventually put them in the box seat to win the Prem in 1996, only for Fergie's mind games, which led to Keegan's infamous "I would love it" rant, derailing Newcastle's championship bid and seeing United win yet another title. Down the road, this Geordie capitulation would add to the Sunderland fans' joy, who themselves were experiencing a revival of sorts under manager Peter Reid, gaining promotion that same season. Back in the Prem, the Tyne-Wear Derby's hotly anticipated return was devoid of some of its signature spice. Brutal crowd trouble in previous meetings meant that away fans were barred from both games, to the dismay of Premier League broadcaster Sky and fans across the land. Sunderland's dalliance in the Prem would unfortunately be short-lived. In 1997, they were relegated once again, having to play their inaugural season at the Stadium of Light in the second tier of English football. Another historic matchup between the two teams took place in 1999. Newly promoted Sunderland clashed with Newcastle at St James's Park. As the torrential rain lashed down on the pitch, and with club legend Alan Shearer having been dropped for Hardman Duncan Ferguson, the Black Cats registered a famous victory in their rivals' backyard. The Geordies were incensed, and this proved to be the final nail in the coffin for Ruud Gullit, whose promise of really sexy football fell flat, with the manager axed shortly after the defeat. The Naughties would see Newcastle compete at the top end of the table and play Champions League football under ubiquitously loved manager Sir Bobby Robson, whereas Sunderland would stay true to form and continued yo-yoing between the Premier League and the Championship. 2008 would mark another landmark victory for the Black Cats in the Derby, with Kieran Richardson's thunderbolt free kick underscoring Sunderland's first home victory against Newcastle in 28 years. And Newcastle's malaise would continue that season. Interim manager Joe Kinnear couldn't get a tune out of the team, arguably because he barely knew who his players were, once referring to Charles Nzogbia as Charles Insomnia. A last-ditch effort to improve performances by bringing in club legend Alan Shearer as manager fell flat and saw Newcastle relegated in 2009. For the most part, the 2010s were a miserable time for both clubs. Moments of joy and successful seasons were often punctuated by relegation battles, and indeed relegations. Given this, encounters between the teams held extra significance. Between 2013 and 2016, Sunderland fans exclusively owned the bragging rights, winning 6 derby matches in a row. On the pitch, these games were famed for goals by Barini and Defoe, whereas off it, an incident where a Newcastle fan punched a police horse after derby defeat highlighted the visceral intensity of the rivalry. However, the managerial merry-go-round at both clubs, paired with increasing angst over how the teams were run by their respective owners, saw a dark cloud loom over the northeast for years to come. While the sentiment across the Geordie fanbase was often one of fury directed towards Ashley and the Newcastle board, fans of the Black Cats were plunged into the depths of despair when they suffered back-to-back relegations, all of which was painstakingly documented on the Netflix series Sunderland Till I Die. There was light at the end of the tunnel though. In 2021, Newcastle fans lined the streets to celebrate the Saudi takeover of the club, marking an end to Ashley's lacklustre 14-year reign, and Sunderland finally managed to gain promotion to the Championship in 2022. Still in separate divisions, the Tyne-Wear Derby finally returned in 2024. With the cup tie hosted at the Stadium of Light, someone at Sunderland had the harebrained decision to turn the away bar into what can only be described as a shrine to Newcastle, redecorated in the club's colours and with slurs about the Black Cats painted on the wall. With the Newcastle fans in great spirits and the team resurgent under manager Eddie Howe, the Magpies strolled to a 3-0 victory, with Sunderland's 27-year-old chairman having to issue a public apology to the home fans for the bar snafu. Now in 2025, with Sunderland back in the Premier League and Newcastle having ended their 56-year trophy drought, fans across the world look forward to fiery derby matches for years to come. Thanks so much for watching. Please do like, comment and share if you enjoyed this one, and stick around for the next video on the Football Documentary channel.